Hi, welcome everyone, and a huge thanks to you all for joining us today. We've got a very large audience. We're really delighted to have you all with us. My name's Deborah. I'm from Lumina Datamatics, and for those of you who don't know us, we work across, just a quick introduction, we work across all content types, subject areas, providing content production, editorial, accessibility services to large publishers, societies, university presses, education publishers and e-learning providers as well. So the whole gamut of types of users. This is actually our first in a series of webinars, and we're going to focus them on accessibility. Really proud though that we're doing it at this time actually, because this month is the Global Accessibility Awareness Month. In fact, throughout all of May, and we're delighted actually that we've timed this really quite well. We all know digital accessibility in publishing is crucial, and I think we're all knee deep in the various tasks associated with it at the moment. So we're going to really focus this webinar on image descriptions. We're going to deep dive into the what, the whys, and the hows. And to help me do that, I've got three experts with me today. We've got Stacey Scott, who's Head of Accessibility at Taylor & Francis. We have Simon Mellins. He's a publishing consultant and accessibility expert. And my colleague Tarun Mitra, who's VP of Operations and actually leads our accessibility team here at Lumina Datamatics. So thank you guys for helping me out here today. Stacey and Simon are going to start us off, and we're going to discuss in depth the way forward, how we do this, some of the areas around compliance as well. And then we're going to just tap into at the very end how Lumina can help you with this as well. So ask any questions that you've got. There's a Q&A box under at the bottom there, and we will try as much as possible. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and we'll ask questions as we go, or we'll leave them at the end. But whatever happens, we will answer each one and send over the questions afterwards if we don't get time. We've got 45 minutes to an hour, and it is being recorded. So we will be sending out the recording to all of you. We've also got a really helpful resources, some documents in the resources area of the webinar here. So do have a look into that as well. We've got some sample alt text, and we've got some other documents that I think you'll find useful. But we'll send those resources to you afterwards as well with the recording. So let's get started. I wanted to just quickly kick this off, really. We did a poll on LinkedIn, where we asked the question to our audience there on LinkedIn: how do you actually handle image descriptions in your publishing workflows? How do you do it? Where are you with it? An interesting result, no major surprises there, but 74% said that they are actually making all their, adding alt text to all of their images, which is great news. 17% they're adding them for just some. Now here are the naughty ones. 5% actually said that they rarely include alt text, and the rest, the 4%, said they actually make it optional. So we'll put them in the naughty corner. But perhaps after this session, they're going to learn, and you'll all learn a lot more about what are image descriptions and how important they are. So, okay, let's get started. Stacey, can you start us off by explaining really what are image descriptions, and expand on some of your real life experiences?
Absolutely, thank you. So image description, we've probably heard it mentioned in a variety of different contexts. It is an umbrella term which includes a number of different options. So first, alt text, or alternative text as it's known, a short description of an image, to reverse an old English proverb, to be heard and not seen. So this means that it can be heard by somebody using text to speech, which I'll come back and explain later, but it can't be seen by somebody looking at it on the screen. So it is there to describe an image. We also have what we call long descriptions, and those are typically used for more complex images and graphs, such as would be found in STEM content, so science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine. The good thing about these long descriptions is that a special sort of assistive tech user, if you like, can actually interact with that long description, because it is not heard and not seen, it is seen. And so there is no standard at the moment for where long description should be placed. Some publishers will place it directly below the image, some will include it in an appendix. It is very much up to the publisher, what's needed and what looks best in that context, but there is no standardized method for long description at the moment. We also have decorative images, and so they're essentially there to make your website or your content look pretty. They don't typically add any relevant information, and so quite often we would say not to bother adding alt text to those. We can live without that. Captions, quite similar. They're actually text that already exists. So perhaps you have a photograph and that photograph has a caption. What you want to avoid if you have alt text, so describing that particular picture or image, is that you don't simply repeat that caption, because your text reader will say the caption, it will say the alt text, and you will hear it in double. And once is okay, but when that happens 10, 20, 30 times, say on a web page or a book, it might drive someone crazy. And so avoiding repetition is quite important. And the same goes for context as well. So if you've got a book or a page where you've described, what's coming up in a table or in an image, and it's sufficient, then you don't need to repeat that description again when you use alt text. So real life impact. So why are image descriptions so important, and who are they for? Why are we doing this? Why are we talking about it? It's really important, and it's something that's very close to me, both personally and professionally. So image descriptions, be they alt text or long description, they're typically used by people who can't easily see or interpret image content, whether that's a picture, a graph, or anything at all that's visual on a screen. So people in this category, like me, will typically use what we call text-to-speech software, which is software that converts anything digital from visual into speech. And so the user would navigate using their keyboard. They would listen to the text on the screen, whether it's in a book or a web page or an email, Excel document, all of that good stuff. And they would interact using keyboard shortcuts only. And so, describing images really does open up a world of digital content and makes for a fully inclusive user experience for everybody. So there's also the compliance aspect. And so we've talked about, why should we do it? And what's the impact of doing it versus not doing it? But there's also a compliance aspect. So let's talk about that. So most of you will have heard, I would hope would have heard, of the European Accessibility Act. I feel like I hear about it probably 50 times a day, so I'm sure it's come up in your world. And also the WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So the EAA, European Accessibility Act, initiated in 2015, adopted 2019, and coming into force next June 2025, exciting, is an EU directive that essentially aims to remove barriers between people with disabilities and the companies' goods and services. It aligns with as I mentioned, the WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines produced by the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. That's easy for me to say. We could do an entire series of webinars just on the EAA and WCAG alone. Importantly, I think the key message is that only by adding image descriptions in the appropriate way can you fully comply with the EAA and WCAG standards, because without these descriptions, your content is not accessible to everyone.
Yeah, really wonderful. Thanks, Stacey. And I think on the image descriptions, I just can't imagine why this hasn't been done sooner. There's been so much content that hasn't been available to blind and partially sighted people that it's just pretty astounding, actually. Simon,
Absolutely.
did you have anything more to add on the compliance side?
Yes. So hi, everybody. I'm Simon Mellins. The EAA is the sort of hot topic at the moment, coming into force next year. But it's important to note that the EAA is not in itself a law or a set of laws. It's a directive. And the nations of the European Union have to make their own laws to reflect it. So far, they have been more or less copying it one for one insofar as the actual legislation is concerned. The only differences are the market surveillance authority in each territory. So literally who's going to adjudicate and look after this, and whether or not there's a grace period for catching up with the backlist. I won't go through all the different interpretations so far here, but suffice it to say there are subtle differences. And on one hand, it's important to be aware of those for the different markets that you might be selling into. But on the other hand, it also is easier to just be as compliant as possible, assume the strictest possible interpretation, and then you'll have no barriers to selling into any markets. Important to note as well that they all require image descriptions in front and back list, so there's no room for debate there. I really think that trying to duck and dive around the legislation or pick in the wording at this point is pointless. Sense the future direction of travel here, legislation in different countries all over the world, outside of the EU as well, it's all moving in this direction now. So really, any attempt to get around it for now is just buying time. The other important aspect to keeping up with compliance is discoverability. So apart from the fact that there's no point having these features here if people don't know that they're there, it's also part of complying with the European Accessibility Act. So you'll have two different types of metadata that you need to express for your entire catalog. There's schema.org metadata in the OPF file of your ebooks. I hope I didn't lose anyone there. And Onyx code list 196. Both of those are different ways of expressing the properties, the accessibility properties of a given publication. The Onyx is arguably more important because the schema OPF doesn't seem to be being picked up very often, but really the two express very similar information and you should be doing both. It's important for the Onyx code list that you're outputting Onyx 3, where that vocabulary exists. And it's important as well that you ask your retailers if they're surfacing this information. You know, make sure that what you're providing to them gets passed on to the customer. If everybody is asking them this, they will catch up. And of course, they fall within the EAA as well in their duty to surface that information. So even for books that or publications that you have in your catalog that are not yet described, there is still metadata that needs to go there. There's metadata that talks about books you haven't tested yet. Of course, there's expressing that images aren't described, which is really important. So people know if you've not got around to it yet, they might need to request that you do, or they might just not want the book because of it. You need to be honest about the properties of a given book.
Amazing. No, that was really, really good. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Stacey, for that overview on the compliance side, which is the critical part of it. Yeah, you don't want to get into trouble over this. But opening up your content, providing image descriptions to your images is going to attract more customers to your books and your journals and your content as a whole. So talking a little bit more about spending power and the business side of all of this, there's a term that Stacey, you've brought this to my attention, called the purple pound. Now, this is, from what I've seen, a UK focused initiative, but we've got lots of international viewers on this webinar, so there must be something that applies across the world that's something similar. But Stacey, can you tell us a little bit more about the purple pound?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as you mentioned, Deborah, the purple pound is the UK, coined phrase, if you like, excuse the pun. But essentially, it represents the spending power of people with disabilities. And so, whether or not that's in the UK or another country in any part of the world, it is the concept that people with disabilities, shockingly, some of them have jobs, and some of them have money, and some of them want to spend that money. And if you ask my my husband, he'll tell you that he has a disabled wife who loves spending that money. And so, the benefit to your business is incredible if you consider that 15% of the population as of 2011 were considered to be disabled, and that number must have grown, substantially since then. And so, asking yourself, what other demographic would you deliberately exclude from selling your goods and services to? What portion of people would you say, we don't want their custom, we don't want their money? That would seem like a crazy business decision to me. And so by making your content accessible, you're bringing in the purple pound, the money from all of those disabled people who until now couldn't spend it on your goods or services.
Yeah, really wonderful and quite eye-opening, I think. Before we move on, we have a question. We have a question that's sort of related to what we've just been talking about, really. I'll read out the question. If the image is described in the text and or in a caption, is alt text really needed? And if how, and if how should it differ to avoid annoying repetition?
So the idea behind adding alt text is to make sure that any important visual aspects of an image are conveyed to someone who cannot see it. And so if you read a caption and it tells you what that person needs to know, then you probably don't need the alt text. But a good kind of litmus test for this is, close your eyes and imagine you have that caption. What do you visualize from that caption? And if it doesn't equal or equate to the image that's on screen, or it doesn't give you the same information as the image that's on screen, then you know that you need to add a bit more alt text because you don't have enough information from that caption alone.
Perfect. I hope that answered the question. Any more coming in on that? No. Okay, we'll carry on. Fantastic. That's great. So I hope we've sown a few seeds with this really fantastic information about the what, really, about image descriptions, and the whys, potentially, because of the compliance area. Simon, can you tell us a little bit more? Should we go into a little bit more about how publishers can actually go about this?
Yes.
Let's start with semantics, I think. That was, yeah.
That's it. Yeah. So when we're talking about image description, it's the same thing as with everything else accessibility. We're really talking about semantics. We're talking about adding meaning. An image is part of the content of a book. Of course, that doesn't go for decorative images, as we talked about earlier. But if we have established it's a content image, then it's part of the book. If this is not described, then in a sense, it's not there. And it's not just because of print disability. This is something I'm always talking to clients about, and I think it's underemphasized. Adding semantics in any way, and that goes for things that we're doing to the code of a publication as well as to images. Any addition of semantics means you're making content more machine readable. It's a term we're hearing about a lot at the moment because of all the discussions around AI and LLMs. Making content more machine readable means making it more future proof, AI ready, and everything else. There is nothing special, and it sounds horrible, but there's nothing special about accessibility. It's not, the things that we're doing for accessibility are not solely to do with print disability. They're simply making a book more machine readable and providing the hooks that different technologies need to be able to interface with that publication in any way it might want to. The side effect of this is that any electronic publication suddenly has become a better canonical definitive source of a publication than even the print version, because suddenly all of this semantic information is embedded there. This also means that any future formats that come along are much less scary because it's much easier to transform rich code than it is things where everything is just presentational or assumed. It's also much more likely that any files you produce in this way will be compatible with any future technologies. And of course, this includes AI, the hot topic of the moment. And one of the best ways to think about this is students being able to ask questions about their textbooks, including the images that are in them. All of this is opened up by adding semantics, including image descriptions, into electronic publications.
Yeah, really, really interesting angle on that, Simon. And we actually have another question. I think it's quite suitable to ask this at this point, if we can. So, interesting one. We are a small publisher of around 30 people, circa 30 people, and are implementing alt text for most of our front list titles when authors supply it. Our backlist goes back to around 1900, and we don't have the capacity to add alt text to these titles. Do you have any advice on how to deal with this in selling our titles into the EU?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this. This will depend, unlike some of it, this actually does depend on local implementation of the directive. So the backlist is covered by the EAA. There's no question there, but timescale is the point. So there is no question that backlist, unfortunately, will have to be looked at. And I understand from a workflow point of view, that's frightening. It will have to be done over time, but the amount of time you have to do that varies depending on how the law was brought, how the EAA was brought into local law in your target markets. So it's worth looking at specifically where you're selling into, and from that you can establish what the bar is for disproportionate burden. We're all hearing this, I think, at the moment. This is a carve out in the EAA, but it's not defined in the directive itself. So disproportionate burden can be the amount of time that you've got to use that excuse, the sort of financial bar for that. It all varies depending on different things to do with the size of your organization and to do with the amount of sales for a given title. So before making any determinations, really look very specifically at the markets you're selling into. Other than that, there are things to do before then. So if you've got a really long backlist, I understand that. I was working at Penguin Random House before I became a consultant. And of course, the backlist is pretty enormous. The important thing is, even if you can't get to everything on day one, do you have a system for quickly adding those features into a book from the backlist if somebody requests it? So making sure that your chain to receive accessibility requests is really active and well organized and can quickly remediate a book, and that any supplier arrangements to do that are in place. Being really quick to answer those queries does best by your print disabled customers, and it keeps you this side of the law.
Yeah, really important. Great. Thank you, Simon. And just to sort of promote Lumina there, we're actually talking to a lot of publishers about backfile now. You know, front file is one thing, and we're talking to a lot of them about how they handle their backfile, and we can help with that. Brilliant. So that's sort of a nice segue actually into getting it done. Learning by doing, Simon. This is a great phrase that you introduced me to as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about the learning about and by doing really on this aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. There are lots of parts of going accessible that you will find guides to, and that you sort of figure out how we do this. But so much of the specific way you'll implement this for your own business is going to be through doing it. We're going to focus, because of the topic of this webinar, on image description, but this does go for other things too. With image description, you really will find over time what you want changes. And that's why I encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to create an image description style guide. I develop these with clients, and they are crucially important when you're talking about particularly contracting out the creation of alt text. But even if you're having authors or editors create it, you want to all be looking at a common set of guidance on how these are done. I'm not going to go through all of the potential variations here, but things like how you want to handle different media types. Should it always say if it's a photo or a drawing? It depends on the type of book. Whether to use the definite article, a painting of an apple or a painting. Guidance on length and depth and detail. These might even vary by imprint. How to refer to the reader. And if you're operating under an authorial or editorial consent model and doing it for them, then you need to be very careful and make sure that you're doing something everybody would stand by. So over time, you'll find things you'd never predicted that because of the nature of images in real life publications, you'll just find a weird situation will come up and you find you need to make a rule for it. So having a style guide where all of this lives, it can only be done gradually over time. You can make a start using common guides online, but you will find you'll want your own organizationally specific one. And you will find that over time, you'll want to iterate that. And the beauty of it is once it's really starting to fill out, you can go and get your image descriptions done anywhere and you just give them the style guide, and you have less of a development process to go through, and you have something to hold people to on a contract to make sure that they fulfilled what you've asked for. The other thing to bear in mind when we're talking about image descriptions, regardless of where they've come from, is testing them in realistic scenarios. So if you actually test with any kind of screen reading software, and I do encourage everybody to try this, it's very difficult if you're not used to them, but it's important to test. When you do, you'll suddenly realize why some of these rules are there, why things can get very annoying sometimes. Repetition is a really big one, where this is why we keep talking about not putting redundant things into image descriptions to make sure people aren't hearing the same information multiple times, or annoying kind of linguistic quirks. Again, by testing these things out, you'll get your own opinions as an organization, and these will affect what goes in your image description style guide. One of the major things that will come up in a style guide is, of course, cultural difference when you're dealing with suppliers from around the world. This is something that I dealt with when I was working on this, and I think it's going to be the case for a lot of people. The biggest thing this comes up in is gendered language. In English, we're rather lucky. We have this magical they, them that gets us away from having to make any kind of hurtful statement. So it's really simple when you're contracting this out and you don't want to risk misgendering or anything horrible. You have this wonderful ability to tell people, nope, just use they, them. Very easy. We're all getting very used to hearing that now. And it's a very brilliant superpower of English. There are other things that can come up. I once had a supplier refer to sunglasses as coolers because in their country that was the normal term. Cultural context does come up. This is the kind of thing you can only work out by developing with a supplier and making sure that everybody's up to a common standard and on the same page about what they're doing.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, great. Some great thoughts there, certainly about those cultural differences. Let's talk about workflows. We've got some questions coming into the box, but we're just going to move on slightly. Let's talk about workflows and really who should actually be making this alt text. I think
so. I'm
Stacey,
happy to take that one. Yes. So big question. So we've realized that it's important to have image descriptions, but whose job is it to create those image descriptions? And more importantly, who should be checking that they're accurate? And so there are a few options to this, whether you're producing it externally by a vendor or an independent supplier, or in-house by editorial and or production, or indeed even the author themselves may be providing some of your alt text. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. It's sometimes the mixture of the above is the most appropriate thing, depending on the size of your publishing house, your workflow, and your resources. I think the two most important factors, regardless of which option you choose, are that first, the alt text is fit for purpose, which we covered earlier. Does it adequately describe the information in a way that is meaningful, impactful, and that really gets across what that image is trying to say? And the reason that's so important is because if you have something like somebody might be studying high-level chemistry or indeed medicine, it's amazing now, 5 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible. Now I know blind people studying medicine, and it's incredible. But in order to do that, the pictures that they have to interact with and the level of description has to be so clear, because that can make a difference. Now they're not going to be operating on you. I don't think we're quite there yet, but you never know in 10 years' time. But it's still absolutely crucial for when they're doing their exams, when they're studying, and when they're treating you one day. You may regret not putting alt text or a long description on an image for a doctor that then is treating you one day and has had no access to that. I jest, but you get the idea that actually context is hugely important, and making sure that the information that image is trying to convey is as accurate as it can be. Now, the best way to do this is to make sure that it's been looked at by a human, or preferably for the more complex subject matters, you want a subject matter expert. And so having your authors, if you can, get your authors to look at that alt text or even write that alt text, that is it could be a very important step depending on the content. Now, authors know their content. They are the subject matter experts in their content, but they are not experts at writing alt text. And so it's not necessarily, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, because your authors might be wonderful at knowing what they're talking about, not so good at describing it to somebody who can't see the picture. And so making sure that you analyze a process and a workflow that sees an output that works well for you. And to test this, going back to subject matter experts, your subject matter experts are also the people that are going to be benefiting from your described images. So visually impaired people who are using text to speech, employ them, have them part of your business, part of that process where you're making things accessible, because they will be the best people to tell you, yes, this description of this image is clear and it conveys what I need it to, or nope, let's go back to the drawing board. And so I would absolutely advise really looking at the different options available and what works best for you, whilst making sure that you always engage with human knowledge, looking at those alt text images, and subject matter experts.
Yeah, perfect.
Of course.
Perfect. Simon, did you have something to add there?
So I really think, in an ideal world, and there are different opinions on this, I think in an ideal world, it would be considered something that what it means to be an editor. That would be one of the skills, image description. You're close to the text. But as Stacey said, authors are not always the best place to do this. Writing alt text is a skill. But nonetheless, in the real world, this is not always possible. And in fact, most of the time, people are saying that their authors and editors either don't want to or don't understand or don't have time. So in the real world, this tends to come down to vendors and consultants. So I do just want to talk a little bit about that. There is now a huge range of services out there to help with image description and indeed code remediation when it comes to accessibility. There is a bit of a rush from all sorts of companies to serve this market, which is fantastic to see. It is worth being very careful when you engage with any of these companies, because anybody can produce a really impressive proof of work, really impressive demo, but look more carefully, check their capacity. Some of these companies are very small, and that might actually really help them with producing fabulous quality, but you want to make sure that their capacity is there. How many clients are they taking on? Can they assure you fast turnaround? We tend to find in this end of the production flow, we tend to get things pretty late, as I'm sure many people out there can relate to. So can you afford to wait longer because image descriptions were held up? And of course, workflow comes into that. What is the provision from any supplier? How are they giving you those image descriptions? How are you getting those back into a given publication? All of this is worth bearing in mind. There's a holistic relationship that you'll have with any of these suppliers that will be ongoing as you work through frontlist and indeed backlist. So really taking a rounded view of how that relationship will work and of that particular supplier's capacity to help you is very important.
Certainly is. And of course, that's exactly where Lumina fit in. We're a vendor, we're a supplier of image descriptions. We have experts in-house, subject matter experts as well. So we'll be delighted to help any of you on this. So we're all talking about AI. We have to mention it. We're certainly at Lumina looking at it very, very carefully and responsibly. Simon, can you highlight really what's important here? You've touched on it earlier, but let's dive a bit deeper into it.
Sure. Yeah, this is the topic of the moment. And of course, when we're looking at backlists and having to put image descriptions on thousands and thousands of publications, of course, we look to anything that's going to make this manageable, and AI seems like an obvious fit for this. And indeed, there are many examples out there of AIs that have been trained to describe images. This is nothing particularly new. Of course, as you would expect me to say, quality is still variable depending on the AI that's in use, and human checks are still vital. So if you feel that you could speed up your process And time is often money in this context. So if you feel you could speed up and save money in a process by using it for a sort of a prompt or a basic framework of an image description, and then have a human check it and edit as necessary, that is probably the angle at which I would approach it if it's of interest. Some things to bear in mind when you're using AI for image description, as we've talked about a lot in this webinar, contextual awareness. If an AI is just being fed a string of images, then it really doesn't know anything about where that image came from. You need to talk to any supplier to make sure that context is taken into account in one way or another, either by the AI or by the subject matter expert that's checking it. So awareness of the context of the book, as well as the subject area and even the cultural context that the book is appearing in. All of this will have an impact on what would need to be in an image description. Does an AI know this? Have you fed the AI the whole book or just the images? And indeed, we'll talk about the legal issues around that in a moment. But really, for now, just to emphasize, images have different meanings in different contexts. There's also editorial voice. We talked about image description style guides. That comes up again here. So if you have got an image description style guide or any other sense of how you want your organization to sound, that might not be exactly the same as any given AI. In terms of the legal side of it, and I will not give legal advice, but do ask questions like, who's hosting this particular AI? Is it an instance just for your company? Is it being shared with others? Is the AI using your data for development? Is it training on your data? Is it learning from your data? You probably don't want it to, because of course that's a risk for copyright. I call that copyright erosion, where your book's information becomes part of general knowledge. So talking to your in-house legal counsel if you have it, or external if you don't, really working out what the limits are of how you want to use AI, what the rules are. A lot of organizations are now developing AI policies. Those need to be considered when you're approaching this, but considered, you need to look at this in its own way, because image description is its own sort of task, but data security is vital.
Absolutely. Good. Well, we're going to tackle some questions at the end. Let's just carry on and get to the end point, and then I think we're going to have some time for the questions that are rolling in at the moment. So first of all, thank you, Simon, and thank you, Stacey, for that talk previously. And yes, at Lumina here, we do have an AI solution. It does help a lot with the heavy lifting of these image description creation. And of course, it's saving costs. It's a really cost-effective solution. But we, as I said earlier, we are using AI in a very, very responsible way. We've partnered with an organization to guide us on this journey. And content is very secure, and we work very, very carefully with each client that we work with. So we are going to just take a couple of minutes just to take you through very briefly solutions that we actually have available. So I'm just going to quickly share a PowerPoint here on the screen. So I'm going to pass over at this point to Tarun, my colleague, who's just going to take us through the solution that we do have. Whoops, I do apologize. I knew that would happen. Let's go back and go back again. There we go. So Tarun, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Deb. Hello, everyone. So RT is Lumina's cloud-based authoring and workflow system for alternative text. The platform serves as a single source for all stakeholders who are involved in an alt text project, including our customers who could use it to track their projects, review, and approve alt text within the system itself. RT has a host of features to aid and assist an alt text author and writer, like AI-assisted alt text, image OCR, similarity index, DE and I assist, and support for dictionaries. Similarity index is where you have a repository of images wherein alt text has already been authored. So our algorithm would look for similar images so that you could reuse the alt text, which speeds up the alt text processing. So a typical workflow would be something like uploading the images and related context onto RT, categorizing the images to determine its complexity and the project budget, followed by authoring, a peer review, and then delivery as an Excel and Word output. So next slide, please. So here's some quick facts on RT. We have processed some 1100 plus titles with over 550,000 alt text using RT in the last 3.5 years, of which STEM constituted about 76% and other disciplines about 24%.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
I hope you're all noticing the artifacts. So yeah, our experience, our team of over 130 people in our team has wide experience across all document types, so PDF, Word, PowerPoint. We're also working across all the different subject areas, STEM and humanities and education as well. And totally, we're EPUB specialists as well. We're a Benitech approved supplier. So we're working in the trade type of titles and the higher education academic titles, producing EPUBs, many thousands of EPUBs, as you can see there. So the experience here at Lumina is vast. And Tarun leading the team is really fantastic. So I think in the last 5 minutes, we're going to tackle some of these questions that are in the box here, 4 minutes actually. So I'm going to just go through them one by one. So regarding covers, this is an interesting one. Will the directive require alt text describing the cover image as well, cover image as well as the wording on the cover, where there is an image and not just text? Simon?
Yeah. Sure. Stacey and I were actually just discussing this one. It's not spelled out in the directive to that kind of granular level, but it's worth thinking about that because a described image for a cover can actually cause a huge amount of repetition. You might be in a situation where the library has read out the name of the book, or the application has read out the name of the book, and then you'll get a description from the image description of the cover image, and then you'll get a title page, and you might get a half title as well. And you might even get it again on a table of contents. So how many times anyone wants to hear, as Stacey said, repetition, how many times do you want to hear the name of the blooming book? So I would really think carefully about, is there anything on the cover that is content? Again, this is always the question, is it content? Is there something on the cover that affects the meaning of the book or that you really need to impart? Then fine, describe it. But I'd say if it's just the name of the book, that is in plenty of other places in your book. And of course, most screen reading technology is going to already have given the title to the user long before then. Stacey, can you speak to that at all from experience?
I would just absolutely agree. Yeah, I can't think of an instance where the title, as in the a description of the front cover, has told me something that the synopsis hasn't, or that is not in the book. So if there's a very rare occasion where that happens, it would be a very odd book, but it might happen. But otherwise, no, I would absolutely agree. I don't think it's necessary to add alt text to the book titles, and it certainly doesn't seem like it's mandated as such in the European Accessibility Act to do so.
Great question, though. Thank you for bringing that up. Another one on about adding alt text to decorative images. Does that add to the user experience? Adding decorative images to print shouldn't be used unnecessarily. So I would imagine that the experience would be the richer if alt text is added.
Again, when we talk about decorative, it's typically to make something look more visually appealing. And so again, it goes back to that question of, does it add is it content? Does it add information? Does it add value? So that decorative image might just be a twirling golden star. If we have a solution that just implements all bits of alt text and there's no resources required, then sure, why not? But actually that's resource that you're going to have to use, and personally I'd much rather that was used on describing images that I actually need to know about, rather than the bits that make the website or the book look pretty. Simon, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you'll get different opinions on this from people about whether they might say, I actually would love to hear that stuff. But most guidelines for alt text, all of them I've come across, say not to describe a decorative image. Also because very often those are going to be different types of page ornaments that are going to be repeated very often in a book, and you just drive people bonkers with it.
Yeah, and again, in our understanding, again, not legal advice, you won't be penalized for not describing decorative images through the EAA.
This is also another point when you're talking about vendors and AI, making sure that decorative images are not described, and then you're not paying for them to be described.
Yes.
Brilliant. We've got a few more questions in there, but I think we're going to have to close shortly, unfortunately, but we will ask those questions. There's some good ones in there about describing tables and charts and liability for medical images as well, actually. Yeah, so I think, Stacey, you started that question in people's heads about, yeah, doctors and using training on images if they're blind and stuff. So yeah, interesting one, that. So thank you. Just brings me to now say thank you to my wonderful panel here who joined me today. Absolutely phenomenal. Stacey, Simon and Tarun, thank you so much. We've got 3 free gifts for you, as you know. We've got some image descriptions that we can create for you, as well as the long list of resources that I mentioned at the beginning. And of course, if you have any questions, just come to us. We've got a huge team of people that really know what they're doing. We're tracking what's going on with the WCAG. And where publishers and content providers like yourselves need to be. We have various other services to do with accessibility as well, so you can see them on the bottom of this screen here. So contact me, here's my email. We will be following up with you, as I say. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you at our next webinar, I hope.